The world is entering a new struggle for power, or did it ever truly leave it? Stoic Geopolitics offers an answer. Don't miss it. I'm Carlos Alberto, the thinker. Yes, the world is changing, and the struggle for power is once again at the center. The pendulum of history gives us a valuable tool to understand this moment. Because history does not move in a straight line. It moves, it swings, and within that cyclical movement, there are moments when tension reaches its highest points. The so-called Cold War was one of those moments, a high point in the pendulum, a stage where the struggle for power was clearly expressed, especially on the ideological level. Two visions of the world, two ways of organizing society, two systems in competition. Then came a different period, a relatively calmer time, but that calm did not mean the end of the struggle for power. It meant rather a transformation, because the struggle for power never disappears, it simply changes form. And in that process, new configurations began to emerge. The Soviet Union ceased to exist, but Russia now occupies that space with different characteristics, far from the previous ideological model. China, for its part, emerges as a central actor, rooted in the old Communist Party, yet with an economic structure that incorporates elements that do not fully align with traditional Marxist models. And alongside them, other actors begin to consolidate. New powers, new balances, new tensions. But if we look deeper into the process, a constant appears, the struggle for ideological power. Different ways of understanding how society should be organized, different ways of defining the role of the state, different ways of interpreting freedom and authority. And in that sense, a familiar pattern seems to re-emerge, a clear bipolarization, not identical to the past, but with comparable elements. On one side, models with a strong state presence. On the other, models with a more liberal orientation. And it is precisely at this point where analysis must go one step further. Because if we speak of a struggle for power, we must observe who is competing for it today, without taking sides, without oversimplifying, but also without avoiding the analysis. In today's global stage, three major actors hold significant influence: the United States, China, and Russia, each with its own history, each with its own structure, and each with its own way of projecting power. The United States generally represents a model oriented toward private initiative, the market, and a concept of individual freedom, with democratic governance through free elections at its core. China presents a different structure, a state with strong planning capacity, centralized political control under a one-party system with active participation in guiding economic development. Russia, with its own characteristics, also relies on a centralized, state-driven structure with emphasis on security and strategic projection. But there is an even deeper point. This is not only about countries. It is about models, models of organization, models of power, models that compete not only materially but ideologically. And when these models come into tension, the struggle for power reaches a deeper dimension. Because it is not only space that is contested, it is ways of understanding the world. And in many cases, this power is also supported by structural factors. Strategic resources, energy, production capacity, and among them, one has been central for decades: oil. Its control, its distribution, and its influence on the global economy have turned certain regions into key points within the world balance. And when a resource has that level of impact, it becomes power. But power does not act alone. It combines with perceptions, with history, with collective emotions. And that is where another key element enters the scene: the psychology of nations, inherited narratives, historical memories, accumulated distrust. And when that happens, conflict is no longer only rational, it becomes emotional. And in that context, narratives grow, they multiply, they compete with one another. But from the perspective of Stoic geopolitics, analysis cannot stop there. Because narratives may explain, they may justify, they may even persuade, but they are not the final criterion. The final criterion is the result. People do not move because of speeches, they move because of realities. They seek better living conditions, they seek opportunities, they seek stability, they seek freedom in their daily lives. And when that movement is observed consistently over time, it becomes an indicator that does not depend on narratives. And so, fundamental questions emerge. How do people actually live within each system? What is their level of well-being? What is their access to opportunities? What is their perception of freedom? What is their real experience of justice? These questions completely transform the analysis, because they take us away from discourse and place us face to face with reality. And it is at this point that the Stoic approach becomes deeply practical. It is not about defending an ideology. It is about observing which systems generate better living conditions, which systems achieve greater stability, which systems allow greater human development. And when analysis is placed at this level, narratives begin to lose strength. Because what ultimately matters is not what a system claims to be, but what it produces in people's lives. And that is where analysis stops being theoretical and becomes truly concrete. This is where the Stoic approach reveals its full strength. Because in the end, it does not matter how a system is defined. It matters how life is lived within it. And this criterion changes everything, because it allows us to observe without taking sides. It allows us to compare without ideology. It allows us to understand with greater clarity. And in a world where the struggle for power continues, that clarity becomes essential. Because perhaps we cannot stop the movement of the pendulum, but we can learn to interpret it. And in that interpretation lies the possibility of acting more intelligently, of avoiding unnecessary mistakes, and of building step by step spaces of greater balance. Because even in the midst of tension, history continues to move forward. And in that movement, the way we think, the way we understand, and the way we act makes all the difference. If you found this way of analyzing the world valuable, if you have any thoughts to share or questions to explore, I invite you to subscribe, leave a comment, and like this video. It's very important because it helps this message reach more people. Because thinking better is living better. In upcoming videos, we will continue analyzing today's reality through the lens of Stoic geopolitics, always with objectivity and impartiality. Until next time, my friends.